My name is Sandra Joyce, and I'm a junior. I'm majoring in Women's and Gender Studies with a concentration in globalization and poverty. I'm going to be moderating our third and final panel on gender in the state. And I'm going to be hearing the papers of 4 women whose topics range from issues of female sex work, women's land rights, child custody battles, and the ongoing Maoist movement in India that has sparked great gender-based violence. So the first presenter, Mina Song, will be presenting her paper entitled State-Sponsored Sex Tourism in South Korea that examines the intersection between sex work, tourism, and leisure travel and the need for greater protections of sex workers. Our second presenter, Harmony Kabangi, will present her paper Engendering Women's Access to Land Tenure Rights, a Viable Solution to Improve Food Security. And Harmony is a junior in the School of Foreign Service studying international politics and African studies. And she chose to write this paper because she was recently awarded the Circumnavigator's Travel Grant, where she will travel to Peru, Brazil, Italy, Tanzania, Zambia, India, and Nepal to conduct field research on women's land rights and food security. The paper dissects the social norms and customs that inhibit women's access to land tenure rights, while also examining the need for women's land rights in order to ensure household food security and sustainable development in developing countries. Our third presenter, Melissa Riggio, is a French and German double major with a minor in Women's and Gender Studies, and she's presenting her paper, Child Custody in the U.S. Legal System. And Melissa chose to write on this topic because she kept hearing men's rights activists and anti-feminists claiming that women had the advantage in court custody cases, and she wanted to research whether or not this was true. So the pervasive myth of female-dominated child custody cases is one that Melissa seeks to analyze and deconstruct. And then lastly, Calanthea May will present her paper, Women in Conflict, Biopolitics of India's Naxalite Maoist Insurgencies. And in order to analyze this topic, Calanthea's work seeks to contextualize wartime female biopolitics. So we'll start with Mina.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here at our first Women's and Gender Studies conference. I'll be talking about state-sponsored sex work in South Korea because I was born in South Korea, and when I came here, I developed an interest for women's studies in Dr. Park's intro class and public health as I came into Georgetown as a pre-med and decided to go with the more upstream factors. And I was interested in sex work as a public health issue in South Korea. So South Korea has a long history of organized sex work, from feudal female entertainers to comfort women of Japanese colonialism to the organized sex tourism industry that boomed in the 1970s and still continues today despite illegalization. And through changing international political economies and gender power relations, sex workers were continuously organized and used by institutions of power, including the Korean government itself, Japanese colonial overlords, and the U.S. military. I'll describe Korea's history of institutionalized sex work, present arguments for sex work as a form of labor, and finally discuss the public health issues stemming from the illegalization of sex work in 2004. The Korean government approached sex work as a position of morality and legality and not of public health, but it is critical that this issue be considered from a public health perspective, as sex workers are one of the most vulnerable populations for contracting and spreading STIs. And illegality prioritizes abolition above protection of sex workers' health and health rights, which, because the sex trade remains normative today despite this law, and sex tourism still continues today, this should be prioritized as an issue of the health and health rights of the Korean and international communities. Susan B. Anthony said, quote, "Whoever controls work and wages controls morals," end quote. To explore sex work as a form of labor, we must move past a single-track analysis of men's sexual desires or deviant women's willingness to offer sex for money, and consider underlying institutional structures and social organizations, such as the dynamics of how the international political economy influences domestic sexual economy. If economic need or subordination leads women to enter or stay in the sex industry, we need a more in-depth look into class inequality, nationalism, globalization, and gender power relations to examine the structures of organized sex tourism. The slavery abolition movement in the West led to an emphasis on contract theory and self-ownership, and this boundary between slavery and free contract labor is drawn by consent, a temporal limit on labor, and reciprocal exchange of wages. However, this is complicated by the following. First, labor, body, energy, will, and time is arguably not alienable from the human being. And second, given unequal resources, the temporal limit is often ignored. And finally, if the wage received is not enough for basic survival and dignity, the exchange does not constitute real reciprocity. The current dichotomy in human rights debates is that sex work is either seen as work, where only labor rights apply, or a situation of bondage, where only human rights apply. Sex workers embody the exalted concept of freedom to sell labor, and at the same time, the continuing market of commoditized humans. Breaking these mutually exclusive categories, sex work is a powerful laboratory for the burgeoning labor rights as human rights movement. South Korea has a history of state-organized sex work. From the 14th century, in the Neo-Confucian feudal state, there were organized kizang, which were female entertainers who performed domestic and sex work and were often taken as concubines. Under Japanese colonial rule, and after World War II, poor Korean women were organized to serve as comfort women for the Japanese and American military, who were meant to stop rapes and STIs, but neither of these goals were achieved. In fact, lax screenings actually increased infections, and comfort women were treated as war supplies and abused at the height of colonial power relations. Korea's history of sex work shows long-standing state organization and support of sex workers to serve within gendered, colonial, and race power relations. Now, sex tourism is an intersection between a legally marginalized form of commoditization, sex work, national industry, tourism, and an international industry, leisure travel. The industrialization of an economic growth-oriented Korea resulted in an influx of more workers from rural areas into urban centers than there were jobs. And jobs available to women paid crushingly little wages, and many women entered into sex work for their subsistence. Eager to build its economy and accrue foreign exchange reserves, the current Korean state encouraged sex tourism as a matter of national policy in the 70s, allotting funds to national airlines, advertising, hotel accommodations, and infrastructure, even mandating lectures teaching both practical skills and nationalist ideology to sex workers. Quote, work for our country's future, unquote. The 1980s saw Korea's heavy industrialization and export growth result in rapid GNP growth and concurrent political liberalization. However, this left the working class still wretched, and sex work increasingly diversified into non-traditional venues such as barbershops, coffee shops, and street prostitution. Prices for sex work became cheaper and more widely available for non-elite Korean men, as more destitute women entered the industry for survival. In 2004, it was a key moment in that South Korea passed the Act on the Prevention of Sexual Traffic and Protection, etc., of victims thereof, or you could call it the Special Law on Sex Trade for short, which made sex work illegal. Police clamped down on traditional sex work venues, and the industry reoriented itself from direct prostitution through brothels into indirect prostitution through venues such as barbershops, massage parlors. And this took advantage of legal loopholes to keep sex work going. The budget for the health care of sex workers was cut, and it became more difficult for NGOs to provide services such as contraceptive distribution and STI testing. Through this law, brothel owners face up to 3 years in jail, or about $28,000 US. Sex workers up to 1 year, or $2,800. And clients mostly receive only fines, and their indictments are suspended after completion of an 8-hour educational program called John School. There are also no administrative measures, such as suspension of business for institutions harboring sex work. So with these consequences, most venues remain profitable and continue sex work on the side, as earnings remain higher than potential fines. So despite the special law, there is widespread noncompliance and the sex trade still remains normative. Shin Pak Jin-young, the president of the Human Rights Center at the Daegu Women's Association, commented, quote, "Even high-ranking government officials and social leaders who are required to lead the anti-prostitution efforts are frequently reported to have been involved in the illegal sex trade." Unquote. The illegalization of sex work puts sex workers in further danger, as they are less likely to seek legal recourse in the face of physical abuse, unfair debt contracts, etc., as they may be questioned as a suspect if they go for help. So with prohibition, sex work became less organized. Yes, it did not disappear, which led to decreased STI screenings and increased rates of infections, as well as decreased access to health care, because few doctors were willing to treat sex workers as they would be participating in illegal activity, was the idea. A study by Min Soo Jung found that syphilis was more prevalent in non-establishment type workers than those in established type brothels. Syphilis is also found to be 5 times more prevalent in sex workers than non-sex workers, and gonorrhea over 20 times in that same comparison. In addition, social isolation and a sense of alienation were important predictive factors for STIs among sex workers. Sex workers in Korea, particularly, face a higher volume of customers than sex workers in other countries, and are more likely to be affected by the consequent psychological suffering, social stigma, and sexual exploitation. So this study highlights the need for social support and psychological health services for sex workers. Now, the special law has resulted in the disintegration of many brothels, red light districts, and which makes reaching sex workers for research and interventions more difficult. In 2010, 1/4 of sex workers surveyed reported consistent condom use, which is significantly lower than 2/3 4 years prior. And those who had regular screenings in the last year had a chlamydia prevalence of about 50% compared to 75% in those who did not have regular screenings. Alarmingly, higher reported self-confidence in condom negotiation was not correlated with lower prevalence rates, which shows the need for better preventative education. And although condom use has proved very effective in preventing STI transmission, we all know this, but club owners do not provide condoms as it could implicate them in illegal sex work. Now, there are some existing measures of STI testing and some health support for sex workers in Korea. STI testing of registered business girls was made mandatory in 1971 and extended nationwide in 1977. However, this was not for the women's welfare, but rather for the benefit of the Korean-U.S. relationship by keeping American soldiers healthy. Sex workers' health was secondary to catering to military power, which is reminiscent of comfort women. Public health centers providing free STI examinations do not sufficiently protect the privacy of their clients. And the tremendous social stigma around sex work keeps many sex workers from utilizing this free and available resource for the lack of privacy protection. The special law did start support programs for sex workers exiting the industry, such as temporary shelters for protection and consulting services for housing and for housing and employment. However, activists are calling for more specified programs and services for women with different needs, such as teenagers, those with children, and those who are handicapped. Protection of sex workers is a public health issue, one that should be as institutionalized and organized as sex work itself used to be in Korea's history. With higher prevalence and risk of STIs, lack of privacy in STI clinics, and lack of condom availability or enforcement of condom use, this is a public health issue. The continuation of sex tourism today translates this public health issue into an international one. To fight these epidemics, authorities must expand access to testing and treatment facilities and educate sex workers about safer sex and risk reduction. We we must look at sex workers' health rights as their labor rights, which are human rights.
So next we'll have a harmony speaking.
Hi. So my paper is on women's rights to land and its impact on food security. So rural women play a vital role in agricultural and rural development in all regions in the world. Women produce more than half of the world's food production, bear the responsibility for food safety, and maintain the well-being of their households. In spite of their important contributions to rural development, women's access to land rights and property rights is constrained by a plethora of policies governing inheritance and access to property. I will argue that the politics of invisibility that constrain women's access to land tenure rights emanates from deeply ingrained structural social arrangement in patriarchal societies. I will also argue that closing the gender gap in the ownership of land is key to improve state-level food security, because studies have proven that women who have greater access to land and property rights spend a greater proportion of their income to promote the well-being of their households. Despite the fact that women produce the majority of the food in developing countries, few women have access to secure land rights. And women who do have any rights to land, these rights tend to be limited to specific uses and times, as to ensure that women have access to enough land to farm in order to meet their obligation as food providers for their households. I have the definitions of what does it mean to have secure land rights. So secure land rights is defined by the rights that are clearly defined, long-term, enforceable, appropriately transferable, and socially and legally legitimate. Land rights may arise from inheritance, possibly on an individual or joint basis, government transfers and purchases, and often include ownership as well as use of rights. Food security is built on 3 pillars: food availability, sufficient quantity of food available on a consistent basis; food access, which means having sufficient resources to obtain appropriate foods for a nutritious diet; and finally, food use, which is defined by the appropriate use based on knowledge of basic nutrition and care, as well as adequate water and sanitation. As affirmed in the Article 14 of CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, women's rights to own, manage, enjoy, and dispose of land is key to women's rights to financial independence and critical to improving state-level food security. Although women comprise 43% of the agricultural workforce in developing countries and nearly half of the agricultural labor force in parts of Africa and Asia, women are significantly less likely to own land than men, and the land they do own is usually smaller and poorer of quality than the lands owned by men. Women's impediment to land tenure security often comes from the existence of structural violence that is ingrained in those patriarchal societies. For example, women's access to land through the states or through the market is often limited. In countries where the state has allocated land to its citizens, the distribution of land has generally benefited only men heads of households. Land title programs, for instance, and registration programs may also fail to formalize women's rights. And because women have less access to capital than men, they are usually less able than men to purchase lands on the market. Aside from formal law governing lands, in many countries, customary laws have significance and sometimes prevailing implications for women's rights to land. Although diverse customary regimes are often determined by cultural and religious institutions that typically favor the rights of men over the rights of women, or deem that men to purchase land on the open market. For example, the concept of male as the head of households, which is at the heart of joint title, has not only been reflected in local perception and customs, but also in national accounting systems, government programs, birth and marriage certificates. This institutionalized gender dimension in land ownership seriously invisibilizes women and make women and their children vulnerable in the event that their male relatives dies. Since men are generally considered owner of the land, customs also allows men to sell the land without permission from their spouses, and also allow men to choose the crops to grow and control the income from the land. Under customary systems, land is usually transferred through inheritance, and it's almost men who inherit the land. Finally, these contrasts reflected in women's insecure rights to land limit women's potential as households, agricultural producer, and household caregiver. This has an impact not only on women, but also on food security and on the nutritional status of their children. A growing body of evidence from a variety of settings around the world illustrate the positive correlation between women's land rights and the decrease in food insecurity around the world. For instance, engendering women's rights to land result in an increase in agricultural productivity, and this production can enhance the household food security and nutrition through two avenues. The first avenue being through the increase of food production for consumption, while the second avenue is indirectly through increased income, permitting the purchase of more and better quality of food for women and their households. In both ways, secure rights to land can help moderate the impact of food price volatility on the market of poor and rural households. For instance, a study conducted in the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh, which provided beneficiaries with plots of land up to 1 acre, found that beneficiaries of this program experienced significantly higher levels of food security. 76% of the beneficiaries reported having 2 meals a day compared to only 50 to 57% for non-beneficiary households. There's also a link in women's role in improving food security. For instance, when states engender women's rights to land, women's status in their society is also enhanced, which enable them to have a greater bargaining and decision-making power at home over and in their community over the crops to produce. For instance, while men tend to favor crops that have a high commercial value on the market, women tend to favor crops that have a high nutritional value for their children. A study in Central America, for instance, found that in some countries, women with rights to land are more likely to have control over household income and access to credit. In Nicaragua, for instance, women with either individual or joint title over land, over half of the crop income, women with access, joint title control, have access to over half of their crop income, while women who have no land rights only control 40% of that income. In Nepal, for instance, researchers found that women who own land are significantly more likely to have a final say in household decisions. In Nepal, once again, researchers have also demonstrated that the likelihood that a child is severely undernourished is reduced by half if the child's mother owns land. The Nepalese study suggested that the route to better child nutrition was through the greater income and resources provided by the women to own the land. As I argued in my paper, women are the invisible workforce and acknowledged by one of their family can contribute greatly to the food security of their households in developing countries. Consequently, I believe that it is necessary for states to close the gender gap in the ownership of land in order to reach food security. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton once says that women's full participation in society remains the unfinished business of the 21st century. So for that matter, I believe that women's participation in society starts at home. So that's why I believe that women's rights to land should be endangered in developing countries. Thank you.
So we're just going to take a quick 1-minute break. Okay, so we're going to resume with Melissa's case. So I'm talking about child custody battles, and specifically in Western countries. And since we divorce, child custody battles are not unwed. There's a big difference. But this paper is only 12 minutes long. All right. So the topic of child custody often comes up when discussing how feminism affects men. Feminists, for the most part, agree that while men do have disadvantages in society, they are overwhelmingly advantaged. Anti-feminists argue the fact that in recent years women have gained all the legal rights that men have. And legally, women and men are equal, quote unquote. Or even more so, that women have overtaken the advantages that men had, but are now the gender on top. When listing off disadvantages to being a man, several items always come up, including the idea that women are afforded child custody and divorce custody battles more often than men. I was curious if this claim that seems so staunchly embedded in this male disadvantage topic list was as firm as it seemed. In this work, I will explore what the assumptions are about child custody in regards to the rights of the fathers, as well as the actual statistics and findings on the subject. I will explore American, Australian, and New Zealander texts, all of which are Western English-speaking countries. I'll present now a brief child custody history in the Western English-speaking countries. Historically, in these countries, fathers had the absolute rule over child jurisdiction during the turn of the 19th century. And later, when the courts began to emphasize welfare of children over anything else, this began to change. Before this, fathers were just given the children no matter what happened to divorce, but now this has changed. Eventually, this led to the presumption before the 1980s that mothers always got the children after divorces because they were the primary caretaker, and as natural mothers, this was good for the child. In the 1980s, this began to change to a gender-neutral rule applied to the courts. It is during this time that the MRA men's rights activist groups began to contest the gender-neutral law preferring women, saying it preferred women, claiming that the gender years doctrine saying that children that are younger should just be given to the mother is still there. These men think that this idea is permeated despite the change in the actual law. In
Now for the background on another part of this issue, an important part, men's rights activists. These groups that I mentioned right now, that are notably in the US, Australia, and New Zealand, consist of members typically in their 40s and 50s, often divorced or separated, and almost always heterosexual. Their masculinist discourses often come from feeling they have been stripped, quote unquote, from their manhood, which could be analyzed as not having as much control over their wife and children as they previously did during these years that I mentioned when they were automatically assumed to be caretaker and divorced. These masculinist discourses and the manifestos that I write on their websites often promote a loss of control they feel, and they feel that this is linked to their masculinity. Because men have usually had more control in the legal system and are more easily able to evoke change, men's rights activist groups have been quite effective in changing policy in the areas of family law. For example, in Australia, changes have been made to Australian family law that shifted the distribution of family tax benefits for shared care, which gives advantage to non-resident parents, usually fathers, to the detriment of the resident parent, usually mothers. Other laws that were supported and pushed for by MRA groups in Australia also made it easier for ex-spouses to exert more control over the resident parents. So what is this myth surrounding child custody, and who gets children more often in custody cases? There's a glaring flaw in the argument made by these MRA people, these groups, when it comes to arguing that men are discriminated against in the courtroom in regards to child custody. While it is true that in a 2003 study, 67% of the mothers had sole physical custody over their children, and only 20% of these arrangements were joint custody, one must examine how these stats came into play. What MRAs fail to notice or acknowledge is that 46% of the cases are decided upon outside of the court. The father, in most of these cases, willingly gives up sole custody of the child to the mother. There are even more cases in addition to that number where court-issued divorce hearings were simply rubber stamped by the judge after the parent decided for themselves what should be done with the children. When it does come to contested child custody disputes, fathers often give what they want when they do choose to dispute for their child. Even after the proceedings have ended, parents still have the opportunity to file for a dispute for custody, and in the cases where the father has remarried, he may more easily gain custody as he's seen as more stable, quote unquote, than before. So what are the actual statistics behind these child custody battles? This is not outside the court, this is within the court when there is a dispute over who deserves or who merits the child. Getting into the custody battles themselves makes for interesting numbers. 31% of plaintiffs in child custody cases are fathers, which shows that it is less common than not for fathers to fight for the right of custody of their children. When fathers do go to the courts to have custody of their children, 38 to 70% of the time they're successful. This is the number I got looking at many different cases in many different countries, like I mentioned, New Zealand, Australia, and the US. Even when the mother is proven to be the primary caretaker of the child, that number is still the same. It is also important to note the motivations of fathers applying for child custody, whether it be legal or physical, joint or sole. It has been noted in several academic works that fathers will sometimes go through the legal process of custody battle simply to harass the mother and put her in a position where she must give up control of the child, as she cannot either afford the money to continue the battles, or she cannot afford the time to continue these battles. While this is not always the case, it has been repeatedly proven that abusive relationships actually get worse after divorce or separation, and child custody is often a tool used to control the women within the limits of the law. When fathers fight for custody, it's often legal custody, not physical, which has been noted as it mostly involves status in several of the studies I read. Legal custody has very little effect on the well-being of the children involved, and not nearly as much as physical custody. In an exemplary case of coercive control, negative motivations for child custody, legal in this case, and the detriment of a gender-neutral system on women, we see how a mother is controlled by the father of her child, who does not contribute physical custody at all. In this example, I use a New Zealand case. In the case of New Zealand, Becky, who had gotten pregnant from a casual dating experience with a man named Shane, decided to try to move back to her native land of Canada after the birth in order to live with her family and get help from them financially. She had very little means of support in New Zealand and would have fared much better in Canada. However, Shane, who was undependable when it came to child care and did not express want for physical custody, immediately went to the courts to have legal custody over Cooper, the child, and thus control Becky as well. She Shane enacted a non-removal order on his son, so Cooper could not be removed from the vicinity of him, thus also limiting Becky's movements as she had physical custody. Shane was proven to be an unfit parent due to drug use, neglectful behavior, and a history of violence, thus leaving Becky no other choice than to stay near Cooper, who had to stay near Shane. This case adequately describes several aspects of a gender-neutral courtroom, where a non-resident parent is given control over the child, and thus the resident parent is having trouble finding support in a system she just simply cannot survive in. Being away from her support system in Canada was detrimental to Becky's well-being, something Shane likely understood what he was doing when he enacted a non-removal order on his son, given studies of motivations of men in child custody applications. Now I have some theory, on why gender-neutral courtrooms are hurtful to women. Now that all the statistics, stories, and studies are out on the table, it's clear that the simple claim that women are taking over the courtroom in child custody cases is a myth. In order to see how this gender-neutral law is detrimental in theory-based work, we'll start with Joan Scott, who discusses difference feminism. The gender-neutral courtroom assumes several things. For one, it assumes from the start that both parties are equal. That is, have similar income levels, similar education levels, similar shared responsibility of taking care of the child before the divorce. This is simply not the case. As we've proven time and time again, that women are the primary caretakers of children, and that there are still wage gap differences. Imagine for a time that we have two contestants walking to a same division wrestling match, but one is already injured. That's the way that it should be described to describe a difference limit. Therefore, continues Scott, we must not be indifferent for the trials that mothers go through as both women and mothers. It becomes even more frustrating when MRA groups argue for more rights for non-resident parents, often fathers, which in theory sound like reasonable arguments, but end up having more control over the resident parents, who already have enough responsibility as it is, caring single-handedly for the child as they have the only visible custody of the child. This is clearly shown in the Becky case, where the non-resident parent caused more trouble than aided the child and the mother just to spite her. Catherine McKinnon also has strong thoughts on the concept of equality. While in her work Reflections of Sex Equality Under the Law, she mirrors much of what Joan Scott elaborated in her case that I just discussed. She explores in depth the concept of be like us and we will treat you the same as we treat each other, unquote. Catherine McKinnon also goes in the idea of what equal without comparison means. For example, as a man will and can never have an abortion, it is ludicrous to think that men have held legal power over abortion for so long. Since the law was made by men, it was made in standard to men, and not to half the population, which will be women. McKinnon puts this succinctly as, quote, women were deemed to be participants in the social contract, while most women in life were not allowed to sign a contract, unquote. This directly ties in with the Australian laws regarding non-resident parents ending up favoring men despite the struggle single mothers go through given their status. Given that women are more abused in general, and even more so after separation and divorce, the fear of worse abuse if the father does not get what he wants in the vow could also play a part. However, these factors rarely come into negotiations of child custody in the courtroom. In conclusion, tying together all these statistics and theories that have been discussed, it is clear that the courtroom is still uneven in how child custody is decided in divorce proceedings. Women, loaded with disadvantages already, are now being accused of overtaking the courtroom with quote-unquote feminist ideals. MRA groups changing the law so that more control is given to the non-custodial parent leaves women more vulnerable to that abuse that more likely comes after separation than before. The pervasive myth of the female-dominated child custody battle does not help feminism to level the playing field between men and women. And only with education about the truth of the situation, as well as difference feminism advocated by Joan Scott and Catherine McKinnon, can the situation be rectified. Analysis of income levels of both parents, noting who is the primary caretaker of the child, risk of history of abuse, and motivations of the plaintiff must all be analyzed in order to have a gender-neutral or even courtroom. Thank you.
Okay, and lastly, we'll be hearing from Columbia.
Thank you for the introduction, Sandra. And hi, everyone. Again, my name is Clanthea May. I'm a senior in DSFS, studying international politics with concentration on security studies and women's and gender studies. So hopefully my presentation today will be interesting enough to keep you fully awake and intrigued at the very end of our student presentations. What I'm going to talk about today is the topic of women in conflict, more specifically, biopolitics of women in India's Maoist conflict. First of all, I'm going to give you a little bit of the context of my paper, the location of my paper, as well as the location of myself, and answer the following questions. Why India? Why India's Maoist movement? Why women in conflict? And why would I be interested in women in conflict? So first off, the reason why I chose India as my country in the first place is because that I was so intrigued by the complexity of gender dynamics in India, in the past, right now, and in the future. And I firmly believe that as India rose into power in international arena, the complexity of gender dynamics in India will be increasingly so. And that's exactly the reason why I chose the case study of India's Maoist movement in the first place. The India's Maoist movement is rooted in 1960s and was reorganized in 2004, so it is a pretty recent movement. The Maoist movement is composed mostly of rural residents in India, and they are up against the Indian national government, and national government supported under counterinsurgency militia. The movement was singled out by Indian Prime Minister as the gravest internal security threat. Therefore, to some extent, we can argue that the emergence, or shall we say re-emergence, of the India's Maoist movement is the response to India's recent development, and which makes it a perfect case study of my purpose. So why women in conflict? As a follower of feminist IR theory, I firmly believe that there's a lack of gender perspective in the current study of international relations and security studies. And that's my reason why women in conflicts. In addition to that, I am personally very intrigued by the Foucauldian concept of biopolitics. Biopolitics basically is the practice of political entities to regulate their subjects through the subjugations of body. During conflicts, the conflicts actually provide us with a great opportunity to study biopolitics, because general networks of power productions are disrupted to produce new competing networks during periods of social vitality. In conflict-torn societies, a female body, I argue, can become a vessel, an object to mark the power productions and flows of politics. Well, I understand that today is not a seminar on Michel Foucault either. Today is not a seminar on biopolitics either. So right now I'm going to moving forward and analyze two specific images of women in Maoist conflicts. Those two images are, on one hand, we have the more established image of women as victims of sexual and gender-based violence. On the other hand, we have the image of women as aggressors, as participants in India's Maoist movement. Well, by no means I am denying the multiplicity of women's images in Maoist movement. The reason why I mainly talk about those two images is that I believe those two images are the most established. Therefore, I think they deserve further analysis, and more importantly, we should problemize those two images. First of all, I want to talk about women as victims of sexual and gender-based violence in India's Maoist movement. During my research, I found that counterinsurgency forces and Indian government forces actually practice gender-based violence as a way of intimidation and punishment. Those practices were in turn strategically utilized by the Maoists as a key motivation and therefore recruitment strategy during the local insurgencies. Because my research is mostly, the methodology of my paper is mostly reading primary sources, so here comes a rather horrifying story of Indian women. It's a story about a woman, a perfectly normal woman, a rural resident in India. This woman said that she had been pulled up from the backseat of her brother's bicycle and gang raped by the counterinsurgency militia on the road, and at the same time, her brother had been shot. After being captured, she was taken to the local camp and raped over and over again during the next 10 days. Not only was she sexually exploited by counterinsurgency militia, she was also charged and put in jail as a way of resettlement and relocations. This is not only a story about one woman. This is a shared story for hundreds and even thousands of women who live in rural India, being sexually exploited by counterinsurgency forces and government forces. Some of them joined Maoist insurgencies later. Some of them encouraged their brothers, their fathers, their fellow countrymen to join the insurgency. If we position the story in a biopolitical context, women's body and sexuality, especially the purity of their body, are symbolic of and central to a community's sense of honor and cultural identity. Female body is also regarded as a platform for the expression and transmission of a community's collective masculinity. When a female body is violated, the sexual violence incites community members to revenge and rebel against the outside violators, and in my case, government forces and counterinsurgency militia. This momentum has been well utilized by the Maoist local leadership in this recruiting process. However, at the same time, we have to problematize this image of women as a victim of sexual and gender-based violence. It is very important to notice the potentially problematic nature of such strategy. Sexualized women have become a useful category to be exploited for the political and economic objectives associated with Maoist recruitment. The image of women as sexual victims has been integrated into the official Maoist propaganda out of practical needs, which eventually causes a problem of objectifying women and taking their agency away from them. Let's pause a moment and then move on to the second image of women as aggressor and as participants in the Maoist movement. Such image actually surprises a lot of people because the image of women as aggressor and as participant in Maoist movement confuses the binary perception of masculinity versus femininity. Those women, those participants of Maoist violence, they embody traditional notion of militant masculinity, which is often defined as tough, assertive, and heroic. And such image is in fundamental opposition to the image of traditional notion of femininity. However, in reality, in Maoist movement, women's engagement in Maoist violence is clearly not just a footnote to men's order. However, here comes the twist. What's so special about Maoist movement is that many women in rural area actually identify with issues Maoist raise in terms of gender discrimination, class inequality, and untouchability. Those women are hoping for liberation from traditional patriarchal domination and societal oppression through participating in the often violent Maoist insurgency forces. Such is the case of KAMS, a Maoist women's organization with over 90,000 women as enrolled members. This organization is of course banned by the Indian national government because of its status as a frontal organization for the Maoist movement. The women of KAMS have become a formidable force and rally in their hundreds and sometimes thousands to physically confront the police forces. KAMS also reportedly address women's issue at the local level and campaigns against tribal traditions such as forced marriage. However, again, we have to problematize the image of women as somehow romantic revolutionary forces in Maoist movement, because there's always a risk of over-optimism and romanticism associated with the revolutionary militancy. The question of such ideology of military empowerment through participating in violent Maoist attacks can translate into liberation and transformation of the subaltern women and men alike is still critically relevant. At an organization level, the Communist Party of India's Central Committee and Politburo still have no women yet. At a more symbolic level, the agency of a militant woman really depends on her location of socioeconomic situation, and other outside forces. We would fall into another essentialist trap if the complexity of militant women's position is underestimated. In general, my presentation explores two images of women in India's ongoing Laos conflict. On one hand, we have women as victims of sexual and gender-based violence. On the other hand, we have women as aggressors and participants of Maoist movement. For the image of women as victim, female body is conceptualized as a vessel of power productions. The violation of female body was utilized by the Maoist movement as an approach to incite community members to revenge and rebel through joining Maoist insurgency. On the other hand, for the aggressive image, Maoist movement actively produces an image of militant women. For both images, we have to keep the question in mind, the question of whether such ideology of militant empowerment through joining an actual violent movement will translate into liberation and transformation of the women remains unsolved. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, I just want to thank you all for your very thought-provoking pieces and give you another round of applause. So now I guess we're going to invite you all to sit up here and we're going to do a Q&A session. So does anyone have a question they'd like to pose to the group or a specific paper?
After the picture.
It's okay. Give me an action shot.
What action do you want?
The action in front of the room. Anyone? I guess I'll start us off. I guess what I am wondering is how you all see presenting on topics like this at a distinguished university such as Georgetown, an important step in opening up the dialogue about what you guys address in your papers and how that's a really important step in ultimately alleviating these issues.
As I mentioned in my presentation, my concentrations are international security, which is what Georgetown is famous for, and women's and gender studies. By addressing the issue of women in conflict, positioning women's position in international security, I think I can sort of raise awareness of a lacking of gender perspective in the study of international relations and security studies, which is critically important in the Georgetown setting.
I'd say that this conference has definitely given me a chance to look back at all my papers and submit and try to get this opportunity. And in doing that, I found that my intersection of interests in public health and gender studies can take a form of policy and action and possibilities in terms of looking at my future. So I'm glad this annual conference is starting.
In my case, I'm interested in women's rights in general and as well as in international development. So I guess focusing on women's rights to land and the impact on food security enabled me to deepen my interest in both and also raise awareness on, I guess, the contribution that women can make in alleviating food, I guess, insecurity also.
I think this conference is useful for me because I can tell my friends and family, like, look, I'm doing this. And they're like, oh, we actually do things in your gender studies program. Because sometimes they don't even know what we do. It's like this mysterious thing. And so, like, I'm discussing child custody cases and it's gendered. And I mentioned some other people I knew that were doing their topics. And it helped to see, like, what we're actually doing and get the research out there instead of just staying inside your computer and in a professor's desk.
Something thing that kind of like almost startled me a little bit. Some of the numbers that Nina gave, unless I misheard it, you suggested, like you stated that after the sex work was banned, the use of condoms have dramatically dropped. Is that what you were saying?
No, I mentioned that because of the illegalization, the lack of organization and institutionalization, condom enforcement has decreased.
Right. So the condom enforcement has actually decreased because that could be and then the employers who are reluctant to provide condoms because that would be admitting that they were involved in, right?
Yes.
Involved in sex work.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. I have a question for you. So you said that it's not supported by the state anymore, right? That it's not a state-regulated business. How are these programs, these post-sex worker programs, how do they work then? Do you say, hi, I was a sex worker, I'm not now, it's seen as like a turn yourself in sort of thing? Or how do they successfully get this health care if they can't admit that they were a sex worker?
Right, these programs that the special law set up are for sex workers leaving the industry. So it's supposed to facilitate the abolishment of sex work in general. And in doing so, these institutions provide assistance in housing, employment, and such, but they don't address the health problems of people still practicing sex work, which obviously still happens.
And they're not punished at all when they come saying, I did this. It's sort of just like, okay, well now it's like kind of like rating sort of thing. It's like, well now we can help you out. You're not punished for their previous work, are they? Or is it addressed though?
I don't believe they are punished for their sex work when they come to say, help me leave this.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question for Melissa. In your research on child custody, did you come across any research about male experiences in child custody cases that didn't come from a sort of charged MRA perspective?
I did, and it was just similarly stories that they didn't think I was a fit parent due to my income. They didn't think I was a fit parent due to, because it was a gender neutral courtroom, so it was, I didn't have as much income as my wife or as much education as my wife, former wife. And yes, I saw that a lot, but often when I read these stories, they seemed one-sided, just as some of the female stories I read. They left out abuse. They said it was only one time that I abused her. I'm like, so it was hard to read unless you have both sides of the story. But I did come across that. But the only people making the changes, these MRA groups, were actually making law changes.
Right. The reason I ask is because I've come across some research from a best interest of the child's perspective that's talked about fathers feeling alienated because they weren't the primary caretaker during the marriage because they have to take on the role of breadwinner, and thus because they feel alienated and because there's this presumption of maternal that the mother will get it, they don't even try. So I know that you mentioned a statistic that said, so many of these fathers don't even try. And when they do, they're relatively successful, so why aren't they trying? And so an interesting perspective is that they don't feel like they're going to get anything. So they just say, okay, never mind. So it's just an interesting, I'll let you know afterwards the article letter if you're interested.
Yeah, I've run across that a lot, and it's frustrating because then we get back to the mother of the natural, which was in my extended paper. I just read this. And it's also harmful to women, so it's like nobody's benefiting from this woman as a natural thing.
Another question. Cynthia, the Maoist insurgencies, could you tell us a little bit about how Maoist insurgencies, right, especially Maoist insurgencies in India, are defined by people who are participating in it? For example, Maoism in China, are there any differences between how they are defined? I mean, does it just mean that they are mostly those who are participating are peasants? Is that why it's called Maoist insurgencies? Or any of the Maoist ideas are actually actively embraced and articulated as their political agendas?
Yes, I think the reason why they're called Maoist insurgencies in the first place is that they inherit part of the Maoist ideology from China, including gender equality, equality for especially untouchable people in India, and just in many aspects. And what's so special about the India's case is that it's the Maoist movement in India has become increasingly tribalist, which means that in China the situation wouldn't be like China doesn't have so many tribes, but for India's situation they have so many tribes, which makes guerrilla forces a more important part in Maoist movement in India. And because the reason why I cannot give you a very definite answer is that it's still pretty much ongoing. It was reorganized in 2004, and the methodology of my paper was through reading primary sources, and there was very limited primary sources right now, like books published I can read. I was going through a lot of documents within India and abroad about the Maoist movement, but still, like, they're producing a large amount of literature right now, but we still do not have access to them.
The ideology of gender equality as one of Mao's main agendas is being embraced by those
Yes.
people.
So in Maoist, either the original or the India one, both of them emphasize the concept of gender neutrality, which you can see during the Maoist, the Cultural Revolution actually really promotes gender neutrality. I'm not saying it's a very good thing, but they did emphasize gender neutrality.
One more question. How many, the idea that actually, right, women's land rights, if women can own land, that actually is a significant, that makes a significant difference in food security. That actually is one of the, right, wonderful insights that almost like humankind came up with in the last 10 to 15 years. It's a combination of a lot of anthropologists who actually went out and took a look at, right, who owns land, and when the legal system changes, what happens to what actually, the caloric, for example, caloric is consumptions that people have, right, in terms of food security. Bringing them together was a really wonderful collaboration among anthropologists and policymakers, and of course a lot of just activists on the ground. How much do you think, how well those insights incorporated into, for example, right, some of the international organizations making policies and going out and actually changing the way they do things when they actually are going into those countries who are having those problems over the food security in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Can you tell us a little bit about how UN is incorporating this insight into their agenda, etc.?
I'm not really sure about the UN, but the World Bank is adopting a more, I guess, gender perspective on, rights to land and food security. So the World Bank is implementing several projects, not only in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Asia and Latin America, where basically they would allocate, plots of land to women, and basically also provide them with crops and technology to help them produce, nutritional crops that would be helpful for them and their households. Like I said, I'm not really sure about the UN, but the World Bank is definitely doing that. Which I think is interesting because the World Bank has had a history, at least in Sub-Saharan Africa, of basically implementing projects that were not helping the community, but on the other hand, creating more tension. Like for instance, in Ugandan village, the World Bank had, their land allocation program, and basically instead of, allocating land to women, or instead of making sure that the land that they were allocating didn't belong to anyone, they just basically allocated plots of land that belong to people, and then people has to be dislocated, which created other problems. So.
There aren't any more questions. We can, I guess, wrap up. Sandra, do you have some final words?
Thank you again for presenting, and thank you all for being here.
So we are going to adjourn for 20 minutes now. We have 20 minutes to gather ourselves, maybe have a little bit more refreshments, and we'll all get back together at 2:30 for our keynote session, right?